globally. And we have here, some of the leading experts in the country on public opinion about immigration and immigration policy. And I'm going to start with our chair, Irene Bloemraad, who I'm going to introduce, who herself is one of those experts and who agreed to chair this event. Irene is a professor of sociology and the Thomas Garden Barnes Chair of Canadian Studies at Berkeley. She's also founding director of the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative, and she has written extensively on multiculturalism, immigration, democracy. Her book, Becoming a Citizen, Integrating Immigrants and Refugees in the United States and Canada, is really a seminal book on that topic and really very well worth reading. Irene has a degree from McGill University. So does Matthew here, and so do I. So we're the McGill contingent here. And I'm going to let Irene introduce everybody else, but I do want to say one thing before I pass the baton to her, is that I was very fortunate and proud to be the PhD advisor of both Matt and Morris, and everything that they say that you agree with is due to me. Everything they say that is garbage is due to some other advisor they had who is not in the room. Okay. Irene, why don't you take that?
All right. Let me join with Jack to thank you all for coming on this Friday afternoon. As Jack mentioned, I think immigration has to be one of the most pressing issues, not just in U.S. politics, but in politics across the world, whether it's in Europe, South America, East Asia. We can think of Rohingyas and the situations in Southeast Asia. And so it's a real delight to welcome back our graduates from the political science PhD program to talk to us about immigration and politics in the United States. We also, I think all three of us owe thanks to Jack Citron, because when he was director of the Institute for Governmental Studies, he would help field surveys that are still going on at IGS, but importantly would allow junior scholars, both graduate students and then junior faculty or associate professors such as myself, to put questions on the IGS poll, which was really very important for many of us to get research done in a much more economical way if we were trying to do this all by ourselves. So Jack, thank you very much for all the work that you've done to help us do public opinion research on this really important topic. So we're first going to hear from Morris Levy and from Matt Wright. Morris is currently an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. He does research on public opinion, race, ethnicity, and sort of more generally has written extensively on American politics. Keep your eye out. He's been writing up a storm, and I'm sure there's many publications that are coming out. Matt Wright was at American University and has recently transitioned to the University of British Columbia, just up the road, so to speak. He has written also extensively on immigration, national identity, diversity, and in political science journals and also political psychology journals. His article, Is There a Trade-Off Between Multiculturalism and Immigration?, was published in Perspectives on Politics and was awarded the Best Article Award by the APSA Immigration and Citizenship section. And so we're going to hear from them first for about 20 to 30 minutes, maybe 30, and then we're going to have commentary by one of the leading academics on issues of public opinion and sort of political psychology, Nick Valentino. Nick comes to us from the University of Michigan, where he is research professor at the Center for Political Studies, PhD from UCLA, but we're allowing him on our panel anyways. And he's currently serving as the president of the International Society for Political Psychology. And we're very thankful that you went so far in these strange coronavirus times to come and give commentary.
It's my pleasure. I was alone on the plane here. So.
Well, isn't that a wonderful change? TSA times are probably really low. So Nick will talk to us about 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for conversation, discussion, questions, and I'll be moderating that. So without further ado, Matt and Morris.
So thanks. I'm going to sit for just a second because there was something else I wanted to throw in that's not in the slide. But first,
thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. This is so exciting to be back here to tell you guys about work we've been doing. I would be remiss not to point out Irene's modesty in not also taking credit for the article, the aforementioned award-winning article, which she was an equal co-author on. So I want to throw that out there. And thanks to Nick and thanks to Jack and everybody. This is all very cool. So the way I wanted to start, and the reason why I'm sitting here right now, is I wanted to sort of start things off by telling you guys pulling two quotes that sort of represent visions of what America's relationship to its immigrants. The first one is from Walter Lippmann in his very famous and influential book, Public Opinion. It goes like this. It's about a pageant, I'm quoting now, which a friend of mine once attended. It was called the Melting Pot, and it was given on the 4th of July in an automobile town where many foreign-born workers are employed. In the center of the baseball park at second base stood a huge wooden and canvas pot. There were flights of steps up to the rim on two sides. After the audience had settled itself and the band had played, a procession came through in an opening on one side of the field. It was made up of men of all foreign nationalities employed in the factories. They wore their native costumes, they were singing their national songs, and they danced their folk dances and carried the banners of all Europe. The master of ceremonies was the principal of the grade school, dressed as Uncle Sam. He led them to the pot. He directed them up the steps, to the rim, and inside. He called them out again on the other side, and they came, dressed in derby hats, coats, pants, vests, stiff collar, polka dot tie, and all singing the Star-Spangled Banner. So that's one view, okay? The other view, this one's shorter, and it's from noted wag H.L. Mencken, and I quote, "The normal American of pure-blooded," quote within a quote, "a pure-blooded majority goes to rest every night with an uneasy feeling that there is a burglar under the bed, and he gets up every morning with a sickening fear that his underwear has been stolen." Okay. So those are my two quotes to sort of illustrate where Morris and I are coming from, and so after a fashion, right? And so we wrote this book over I don't know how many years, 6, 7 years, something like that. The main goal of the book was to establish the importance of core values, the set of which we call civic fairness, as an alternative to, or we could soften that up and say a supplement to, depending on how we want to think about it, more group-centric accounts of immigration attitudes. And I'll tell you more about what I mean by that, what we mean by that. But for now, the book makes 3 major arguments. The first is that civic fairness values, as we define them, explain nuance in Americans' policy attitudes that group centrism can explain. That's one thing. The second argument that we make is that a lot of empirical patterns that are used to support group-centric theories are often better explained by civic fairness values exerting their influence. And the third thing is that when civic fairness values and group loyalties come into conflict with each other, the former tends to exert a stronger pull for most Americans most of the time. And mainly what we're going to talk about today is this first one. Although we're happy to talk about all aspects of these. Most of the exhibits we're going to pull have to do with this first question. And essentially the premise is that the defining feature of American opinion on immigration, to us anyway, I mean it depends on the beholder, right? But to us, isn't warmth or hostility to immigrants and immigration. It's actually ambivalence. And so when I say, I'll just clarify briefly, when I say opinion on immigration, what we mean is immigration policy. Whether people think there should, Jack knows it, says it better than I do, right? But who gets to come, how many, and on what terms, something of that nature. And so the policy questions, we're trying to sort of pull this apart and see how this relates to broader questions of group identity, these values-related issues, and sort of deeper questions about whether or not people, how people feel about immigration in the abstract. But mainly our starting point is this idea of ambivalence, and we're going to show you some examples of that. Before we turn to that, though, what I want to talk, I just want to set up the talk a little bit more formally and talk about the different alternatives in the literature as we see them. So our main foil in this work is what we refer to as a group-centric view. The claim of most people operating in this literature is that people, average people in the street, when they make decisions about immigrants or immigration, they do so on the basis of considerations of us versus them. And so we have, pulled some examples out of this. This is sort of, op-ed material. For example, so I think this was from Washington. Which one was this one from? The Soto one. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Anti-immigrant sentiment is about Latinos. Negative feeling towards this group drives anti-immigration stances. And we have Jennifer Rubin saying, the excuses for opposing immigration or for deporting illegal immigrants en masse no longer pass the smell test. Strip away the fallacious arguments and you arrive at an uncomfortable truth. This is largely about plain old bigotry. So these are sort of pure distillations of a group-centric view. The logic of this sort of approach to immigration attitudes is simply that people have an entrenched understanding of who we are, what is us. and then they draw a boundary around that identity, that social identity. They then feel an impulse to reward in-group members. We want to give us things, and we want to punish outsiders. Not always, but especially when they're sort of viewed as being a threat. So threatening outsiders are punished, and in-group members are rewarded. So there's consensus in the literature on the sort of group-centric side that this happens. There is some disagreement in the literature about why it happens. So we have proponents of realistic group conflict theory, social identity theory, social dominance, symbolic racism, and so on, that are all sort of variations. To us, they're variations on a theme, right, of this sort of group-centric idea. And the corollary of that is that the information environment, or what people see and hear and read when they go out into the world, or when they turn on when they turn on their computers and go to read the news, is that the information environment is suffused with group cues, which makes it easy, right? They know who immigrants are, and they find it easy to develop views on this basis. So this is pretty much the consensus model one finds in literature, or at least it's the most common, and we see examples. These are just some of the major works. Among scholars of race and ethnic politics in the U.S., we have Marissa Abrahano and Zoltan Heinal's book that came out a couple of years ago. We have Kinder and Kam's Us Against Them. We have Natalie Masuoka and Jane Junn's book in 2011, Efren Perez, and on and on. And among people who are more in my sort of traditional bailiwick, the national identity, and Jack's as well, we have books that sort of make this general style of argument. There's a great book by Jack and Dave Sears. There's a book by Debbie Schildkraut that came out a few years ago, and Beth Dice-Morris and Kara Wong and others. This is by no means inclusive. But it's, flavors on this argument. So what's the alternative to that? Well, our alternative is this idea of civic fairness. And the main claim is that Americans, when they assess questions about immigration policy, they apply core values. And what we mean in a general sense by core values is expectations about what people owe their society and what they're owed in return. And this theoretically applies to citizens and immigrants alike. They're sort of, the way we think about them is sort of expectations about the social contract. Who's a party to the social contract and what do they owe? Now the logic here is that people have this kind of intuitive understanding of what the social contract entails, which is also a kind of boundary drawing, just like, not equivalent, but in parallel to what we saw on the group-centric side. And that they make a decision about whether or not prospective immigrants or a group of immigrants qualifies as a valid party to the social contract or not, and they make a policy judgment on that basis. So here, the calculus is more along the lines of what is viewed as fair, rather than what's going to benefit us or what's going to benefit my group. And here we have a similar corollary, which is that the information environment is suffused with all kinds of arguments about what are the value stakes of a given policy, what's at stake. So people are able to make those judgments rather easily with a whole lot of cognitive effort. And we're happy to talk more about how we made this determination. There was a lot of content analysis of media articles and stuff that we're happy to talk about. So what I want to do just before I'll turn over to Morris for some findings is I want to talk a little bit about, or just sort of synthesize what I've been saying and what our argument looks like. And so what you see here is it's a table. It's got 3 columns, and the first column is just the element of civic fairness that we're talking about. The center column is the specific attribute of a policy or of an immigrant that would engage that element of civic fairness. And lastly, the column on the right is simply who that should matter more for if we're right. So the first thing that we talk about in the book is what we refer to as functional assimilation. So functional assimilation refers, broadly speaking, to immigrants' ability to incorporate themselves into American society. That's kind of a loaded, there's a conversation to be had about what that includes and what it doesn't include. America's been having a conversation with itself on that subject for, as long as there's been in America and even before that. Mainly what we throw into that box are things like English language ability, education, job skill, human capital, evidence of a work ethic, which is kind of a mushy one, but it's got a long lineage in American political culture, this idea of the Protestant work ethic. All these are aspects of an immigrant's perceived ability to join and thrive in American society. And we think that this kind of thing is going to matter, especially for individuals who would score highly in terms of the underlying value of individualism, right? So people who believe in things like self-reliance and making your own way and so on. So that's functional assimilation. Now, the second aspect of civic fairness that we can point to, we refer to as formal assimilation. This is something that is relatively new in the sort of annals of America's story with respect to immigrants, especially. I mean, we've been talking about functional assimilation since the beginning, but this sort of emphasis on legal status, for example, citizenship status, These are much more recent developments, as there's been the development of a sort of legal, a body of law with respect to who's a legal immigrant to the country and who's illegal, and what they get and what they don't get. These sorts of things have become politicized, as you all know. You can't, it's hard to hear about immigration these days without hearing at a minimum stories about undocumented immigration and so on. So in that, in that category, we have most immigration-related references to legal status, right? So whether or not they're legal or versus undocumented, their citizenship status, whether they're long-term residents versus having taken up citizenship, and another thing which is a little bit more nebulous but meaningful, right? Whether or not they they're perceived to evince a respect for the rule of law. So immigrants who do seem to play by the rules as people understand the rules do better on this metric. So these sorts of things, we think, are likely to matter a lot more for what we call procedural legalists. So people who care deeply about law and order. And that's one that we're happy to unpack later, because there's a lot of, that's a difficult one to wrestle with, but this is how we intend it at any rate. A third aspect of civic fairness that we talk about in the book quite extensively is egalitarianism. So egalitarianism reflects considerations about an immigrant or about an immigrant group or about a policy that reflect ethnicity or status-based discrimination or second-class citizenship. Anything that makes people feel like a norm of equality is being violated. And that's expected to matter a lot more for people who believe in the equality and equality of opportunity and equality of status. So people who care a lot, strong egalitarians are likely to be bothered, for example, by the fact that undocumented immigrants live in the shadows without the same rights as people who aren't in the same situation. The last one I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to flip it over to Morris, is humanitarianism. So humanitarianism we think of as any sort of cue or signal or attribute of an immigrant or an immigrant group or policy that emphasizes human need and suffering. So speaking of immigrants as refugees or talking about them as politically persecuted, and linking that to their desire to come to the United States, that's a sort of humanitarian-based appeal. Also, on a slightly softer edge humanitarian appeal, you find references to family-based immigration. So just saying, we want a policy that unites families is a kind of humanitarian appeal as well in our sort of version of events. And the people who this is likely to matter for are people who are humanitarians, in a word, right? They're people who think it's really important to help others, to alleviate distress, and so on and so forth. So throughout the book, our strategy is basically to manipulate everything in the center column experimentally. So when we tell stories about people or we talk about policies in order to see how people respond, these sort of become the stuff of our experiments. When we decide that we're going to randomly allocate this to that, and we're going to see how people respond to this kind of immigrant or that kind of immigrant, this is largely what we're doing. On the right-hand column, it's harder to allocate, well, it's impossible to sort of allocate people's basic values in an experiment. I can't randomly assign somebody to be an egalitarian or to be a humanitarian or a legalist or whatever. So we have to take a somewhat more, we have to take an observational strategy, and we have to measure those kinds of tendencies with survey questions and then see if they interact with the kinds of experiments that we run. So with this as background, I'm going to turn it over to Morris, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the data, some of the main findings.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Irene. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Nick. Thanks to all of you. So with that setup in mind, the question is, well, if we think that values are at work in shaping public opinion about immigration, how would we know? How would we be able to observe this? And so to start off, what we take as our starting point is kind of a hint, just in the breakdown of the way that people tend to think about immigration. So one starting point is to observe that Americans tend not to be strongly pro or strongly anti-immigration across the board. They tend to have a mix of views about the consequences of immigration for different aspects of the economy and society. So, for example, a majority of the public thinks that immigrants are good for the economy in recent years. A majority believes that they do not harm American culture, A plurality thinks they don't increase crime, though it's a closer call on that measure. This is conducted in 2016, so as Trump's rhetoric about immigrant criminality was really surging. But the important point for us, or the most important point for us, is that very few people have uniform opinions across all of these evaluations, suggesting that people can have a mix of positive and negative attitudes about immigration. Most people had at least one positive view, and very few people had negative or strongly negative views. Certainly, very few had negative views across the board, and almost none had strongly negative views on even one of them. And so, so another indication and another starting point is that people's attitudes about immigration policy are not consistent across policies. On the one hand, right, we have a consistent finding in the literature that more people, more Americans would want to reduce immigration than increase it, though a lot of people are sort of in the middle on that question. And yet, when you ask more specific questions about immigrant admissions, well, what about a policy that would increase immigration as long as immigrants agree to work, pay taxes, and obey the law? You get very strong majorities in favor of such a policy, even though only minorities of the public, usually small minorities, although it's grown in recent years, want to increase immigration. And you get similar things even when you ask about lower skilled immigration, immigrants without that much education. That is signaling that immigrants would work, pay taxes, obey the law. It seems to greatly increase support even for increasing immigrant admissions. I won't show you evidence on this point, but though we can get to it for sure in the Q&A, but we observe similar differences in how Americans think about legal and illegal immigration policy. Many Americans who want to decrease the level of immigration nevertheless express support for programs that would give legal status to a whole lot of undocumented immigrants. Many of those very same people support ratcheting up border enforcement, even a border wall, though the popularity has become more partisan in the era of Trump. And so you get this kind of ambivalence across different policies, what in technical jargon we might call weak constraint. Knowing what a person thinks about one immigration policy is a rather poor guide to what that same person will think about another policy. Now, in principle, that could just be the usual noise, kind of statistical noise that goes into measuring people's opinions in surveys. And so what we're really the rest of the book is to see how much of that is systematic. Are these really people who are thinking about different aspects of immigration policy in different ways, or is there kind of a group-centered foundation to all of this, and then there are just idiosyncrasies and poll questions that lead people in different directions? Another possibility is that people have different opinions about different policies because they associate those policies with different groups. They may associate legal immigration with groups other than Latinos, for example, and they may associate undocumented immigration primarily with Latinos. So there could be a group-centered explanation for all of this ambivalence that would be quite different from our civic fairness perspective, which is that the differences across these different attitudes are driven by the prioritization of values. So how do we try to get at this? Well, we use a series of experiments, and I'll tell you about the experiments as I'm displaying the results. In this particular experiment, we tried to understand why it is that poll questions that give more information about the reasons that immigrants have come here tend to generate very different distributions of opinion about admitting more immigrants than do questions that just ask about immigration in the abstract. So in the control condition, we asked the standard question. Would you like the level of immigration to increase, decrease, or stay the same? We didn't mention whether the immigration here was legal or illegal in the control condition, though we've done this experiment in different ways. And you can see that at least the plurality of the public, strong plurality, would want to decrease immigration in the abstract. But then in different we asked different subsets of the public, selected at random of the survey sample. Well, what about the number of immigrants who are allowed in here because they have family ties to U.S. citizens? And you can see that, that when we talk about family-based immigration, more people would want to increase it than decrease it. What about immigrants who have skills that employers say they need? Same thing. What about immigrants who are coming here because they face distress and persecution in their home countries? And once again, just providing the reasons that that immigrants might be admitted to the country greatly changes the distribution of opinion. People become much more supportive. And the way that we explain that in the book is that each of these rationales for immigration that's written into, that's recognized in our immigration law, speaks to values that that people hold. So, you know, family is both a humanitarian value, and in some of Irene's work, she's shown that it's also tied to conservatism. That conservatives are very responsive to family-based cues. But these are values that are shaping opinion about that type of immigration. Skills signals, you know, to some degree, a drive, work ethic, the ability to contribute, quote unquote, economically, and so that speaks to the value of economic individualism. And refugee-based immigration in quite obvious ways speaks to humanitarian concerns. And so we follow up on these results by showing that people who prioritize each of those values in the abstract tend to respond most heavily to those types of treatments. We've repeated this experiment in many ways, as I said, one of which is to tell people, hey, by the way, did you know that 95% of the immigrants who get green cards in this country come on the basis of one of these three reasons? And so we even, in one iteration, tell people that's about 1 million green cards a year. We thought maybe knowing that information would make people recognize that if they want the level of immigration overall to go down, they would have to make cuts in one of the categories, and yet the results stay roughly the same in any of those iterations, which suggests that the standout consideration to people is not necessarily the level of immigration overall, but the reason, the basis on which people are coming, and whether that is consonant with their values. One other experiment that we did, by the way, I see you took that out of the slides. We, in a related way, we, I should stay on this slide before proceeding to the next. So we asked people about a policy that would admit an additional 100,000 immigrants from Mexico, that experts had recommended this. And, you know, in the control condition, that's about all that we told people. And we said, you know, would you support this policy? And some people supported it, and some people didn't. The breakdown was pretty even. But then we added to that different treatments, different additional information, keeping the origin, the national origin of the 100,000 immigrants constant. So everybody was weighing in on immigration from Mexico, but the rationale was changing. Or we were adding a rationale. And so in one case, we said these immigrants would have to find jobs and learn English. And in that condition, only 16% of people opposed the policy that would greatly increase immigration from Mexico by 100,000. We tried undermining that argument by saying, but they might end up on welfare, you know, and using a variety of kind of negative cues, and support for the policy to admit 100,000 additional immigrants from Mexico, which you might think would be pretty unpopular, remained easily the majority position. And so just kind of more evidence that whatever anchor people maintain for opposing immigration on the basis of hostility toward Latinos is, I think it's fair to say, weaker in the context of these experiments than the information that we give them that counteracts prevailing stereotypes. And so, so in that, in the spirit of that observation, we were interested in seeing whether what prejudice we do observe, what bias we do observe in the way that Americans form immigration judgments, would react to information that counteracts stereotypes. And so, so what we did here, and this is This is one of the IGS surveys for which we're indebted to Jack. We told people at random about one of three immigrants. One we made clear, and we told them the national origin as well, was from China, one was from Mexico, and one was from Germany. And we told them only in the control condition the national origin, and that these were immigrants living illegally in the United States. And I think we told them that they were 30 years old. In the treatment condition, and you can see that in the control condition, there is evidence among white respondents that the Mexican immigrant is discriminated against. This is, the Chinese and German immigrants are significantly more likely to be included in a path to citizenship, was the dependent variable here, than the Mexican immigrant. But when we gave people information, a simple sentence, in each case, Juan has, or Yuan has been working steadily and is learning English. Support for all three immigrants goes up, and the bias against the Mexican immigrant dissipates. It's important to keep this in perspective, not to say that simply providing information is going to be any kind of a panacea for the biases that undoubtedly exist against Latino immigrants in many people's minds. But it is an indication that when people have clear information, not ambiguous information, that they are responsive to that, even to the point that ethnic biases greatly shrink. We tried a similar experiment, instead of with one individual, with a group. So we kind of redid the experiment from that I mentioned a moment ago. What would you think of a policy to admit 100,000 additional immigrants from either Latin America or from Europe? We randomly varied that. And we told people in the control condition nothing about policy specifics beyond that this would involve admitting 100,000 more immigrants. And you can see that white respondents were considerably more favorable to the policy to admit 100,000 Europeans than 100,000 Latin Americans. However, when we provided the same sorts of policy specifics that have appeared in a handful of poll questions, they would have to work and learn English. Support for both policies goes up a great deal, and the information has a greater effect on people's opinions about the Latin American proposal, to the point that the gap greatly shrinks between support for the two programs. So if you thought that people were intensely ethnocentric to the point that they would be unresponsive to any kind of information, that all that they would really care about is the ethnic cue, right? These are Latin American immigrants and I don't want them here. Then you wouldn't have expected to observe this kind of shrinking of the bias, right? Nobody was asked, by the way, in any of these experiments to weigh in on both European and Latin American immigrants, on both Juan and Johan. And so nobody had to sort of like fess up and admit that they were being prejudiced in these experiments. They could feel comfortable enough, at least, revealing their true opinions, even if they were biased. And indeed, in the control conditions, we do see significant biases against Latino immigrants. So a lot depends on the information environment. Let me summarize. We think that a real key to understanding American public opinion about immigration, especially immigration policy, is that those opinions are very differentiated. There are very few people who are well summarized by the term pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant, or at least very few people who are adequately summarized by those terms, which get thrown around quite a lot in discourse. There is a big distinction between the desire to reduce immigration in the abstract, which is quite common, and a kind of operational openness to immigration. Well, when I tell people the purpose of this immigration policy, the rationale for it, people become a lot more receptive. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. As I said in the Q&A, and we can get to this more, the types of people who wish to reduce legal immigration levels are not always the same people by any means who want to crack down on undocumented immigration, and by the same token, there are a whole lot of people who are rather open to legal immigration, who are quite staunchly opposed, categorically, we say, intransigently, to any type of policy that would give legal status to undocumented immigrants. And we trace that distinction to the values of egalitarianism and a kind of a rigid adherence to rules and law. People prioritize those things differently, and that is manifested in the distinctions that people draw between those two policy areas. We think an important takeaway from the book is that values really do matter to people in this area that is often thought of in group-centered terms. They're not simply standing in for prejudice. They're not simply excuses or covers for prejudice. Undoubtedly, they are invoked in that way sometimes, and they serve that purpose for a great many people. But for a great many others, they're sincerely held. They are, however, often filtered through stereotypes. On the other hand, as I've shown you, those stereotypes, at least in some settings, are not intractable. They respond to information, at least as it relates to a given policy choice.
What was the last slide?
Sure. Sorry to go through this quickly. I know I've taken a lot of time. What we find in the last line of the slide is that when we use these abstract measures of values, I didn't show you any of this evidence, this is why I'm skipping over it. They tend to predict what kinds of people respond to which types of information that we include in our experiments. So if we have a measure of egalitarian values that makes no mention of immigration, we'll find that those types of people tend to be especially apt, all else equal, to be open to a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, even if they wish for lower levels of immigration in the abstract. Just one example. Yeah, maybe in the interest of time, I should avoid getting into the caveats. Jack always says that we spend too much time hedging and on caveats anyway. But one thing that I do want to mention is that we think that some of what we have to say involves kind of group-related attitudes, but in a thin sense. That is, identity matters in the sense that identity carries with it a set of values that we value in part because we see ourselves as Americans, and these are cherished American values. But it matters less, at least in the studies that we've done, in the sense of generating a sort of blind loyalty to the group that would override concerns about values. You know, you may be sitting here listening to us saying this and think, well, what about Trump? I think a few points about this, and I know I'm over on time, so I'll just say quickly. Nothing that is in our book should be read as an indication that Trump himself is sincere in what he says about immigration, or that he's not in some way appealing to group-related attitudes in people. Group cues, group appeals can serve a lot of functions in a diverse public. One of which is to appeal to out-and-out intransigent racism. Another of which is to provide a shortcut for a lot of people who carry stereotypes about different groups to make inferences about values and civic fairness. And so an open question, I think, and one that needs further exploration, is how good would further information be? How successful could it be in derailing some of the effects of the group cues that Trump has deployed? Additional directions we want to take this research outside the United States. We know that assimilation matters to people, at least in the United States. That tends to mean a very thin, simple type of assimilation that involves learning English and working hard to provide for yourself, and doesn't necessarily mean throwing people into a melting pot and having them come out singing the national anthem, though perhaps that's desirable as well. We're interested in how much more demanding assimilationist norms are in other countries, and also how strong an influence they seem to play relative to more group-centered attitudes. Sorry, I know I'm a couple of minutes over. Let me turn it over to Nick.
Thank you very much, Morris, and Matt, for writing this book, and thank you very much, Jack, for inviting me here, and Irene, that was a very kind introduction. Thank you all. I really enjoyed this book, and I'm going to try to move I'm trying not to take too much time commenting on it. If you look at my version of it, which was signed very nicely by Matt, it's already dog-eared because I could talk about maybe 100 of the 180 pages of manuscript pages if I had the time, but I only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to restrict my comments to a few things. The first thing my advisor David Sears always told me is you start out with saying something nice. So I have 3 things that are very nice about this book, and I mean them very sincerely. I learned a lot from reading it. It was a very good reminder of how much about the dangers of one-sided thinking about any topic, and that it's always good to be reminded that there are more, that most of the things we care about in political science or any academic discipline have multiple causes, and we shouldn't just imagine that there's only one. It's also very clearly and beautifully written, and almost never condescends to the other side, even when the other side deserves it, which is, and we all deserve it at some point in our academic careers. And then, I don't know, maybe this is just my personality, but I do like this thing about taking on it's brave. It's these guys, you know, they will soon have tenure, but they don't have tenure yet. This is pretty brave argument to make right before you go up for tenure in the academy, that actually this elephant in the room that many of us in the academy believe is the only thing in the room, which is that immigration is dominated by racial animus, is in fact not the only animal in the room, and that there are other explanations for why people feel the way they do about this issue. So this big claim that we may have either overestimated or even to the exclusion of all other arguments focused on animosities, group-based animosities and identities, and in general, but they focus in their case study basically on immigration. That's a big claim. That is going to be something that's going to draw a lot of attention. It's going to be something that they're going to get a lot of pushback on. And it, in some ways, really is a tough row to hoe because there is a lot of, at least superficial evidence to suggest that people care a lot about groups and they apply group stereotypes to immigrants, and when they do, they change those things are highly correlated with their policy views. So I'm going to just talk about these 3 things, but I also have a million other questions for these authors, some of which I've asked them already in the couple of days I've gotten to spend with them prior to this presentation. But I want to focus on 3 questions, really. One is, they claim in the prologue, maybe it's unfair to criticize the prologue of the book, but the prologue says, this is really a big claim because it goes beyond immigration. That is, immigration should be a particularly easy test for group centrism, might be harder for civic fairness. So if we get effects for civic fairness values that are rivaling or in some cases explaining things that group centrism doesn't, then this theory really has legs and is probably something we should pay attention to across topics, not just for immigration, but throughout the sphere of public opinion formation and change or policy views in the American polity and in other places as well. And I don't think that's obvious, and I just have a couple of observations about that. The second thing, of course, is that they pose really 2 distinct causal models for how people make up their mind about this issue domain, and they admit, they know and they admit very readily that they're impossible to test. Both of them are. And so they have to use very indirect, sometimes very indirect, measures to try to really bring these 2 models into competition with each other and in order to see which one is working hardest. And then the last one is, one of the parts of my CV that I've just recently added is to be the associate PI on the American National Election Study. I know that there are people in the room who've worked on the American National Election Study, and I know these 2 are were raised academically by someone who cares very much about measurement, and this is hard stuff. I mean, it's hard for either of these models to be tested rigorously because it's hard to measure the moving parts in this group centrism and the civic fairness model, and I'll just show you a little bit about that. And then lastly, I'll just talk about what I would love to do if I had infinite money and time and smarter graduates and more smart graduate students. I have plenty of smart graduate students at Michigan. So first is immigration really an easy test here for group centrism relative to civic fairness? Maybe this is, again, I feel bad kind of picking on them on this, but if this is true, if this claim is true, then it really expands the weight of this book and brings it into a larger discussion about how people make up their minds about politics in general, which is, I think, something you would rather like to be able to say and to do and eventually to test. But I do wonder about whether immigration policy is thought of in this way, because the them in immigration over time and in any, even with regard to different policies, is not exactly the same. I take your point about the distinction between legal and illegal, but I think with regard to many different types of policies, the difference might actually be pretty significant. So let me see if I can give a specific example. I have notes here. So in the case, if we think about the literature on welfare or crime or affirmative action or other policy domains, we can think of a set of arguments that elites have been making for a long time and a focus on not just groupiness, but specific group dimensions. That is, that the bad guys when it comes to crime and welfare and affirmative action are those people who we can all imagine are not only not white, but they're also a specific not white group in America. And that might be the same in the immigration domain, but it might not be. And actually, we have some evidence, that is, I and some of my students and others in this literature, that's not true. And further, an example of it might be, this is a more obvious example, a travel ban, a Muslim travel ban and a border wall might invoke different groups. And so attitudes about those different groups really have to be carefully examined, and you have to measure those different attitudes carefully and equally, and they have to be measured with equal validity in order to pit this model against the civic fairness model fairly. And I'm not sure exactly that we've gotten all the way there yet in this book, but as I said in my complimentary part, the balance that these guys strike here is never to say group fairness, group centrism is irrelevant, or that racial attitudes matter not for any of these things. And in fact, all their evidence, if you look carefully, sometimes shows that those things matter a lot in each of these cases. Their point is that that's not all that matters, and in some cases, fairness matters a lot as well. I'll just show you one interesting distribution from the dissertation of a student of mine at Michigan right now. He's wondering about he's actually an immigrant from Russia, and he's trying to measure the schemas that people hold in their heads about immigrants in the United States and in other countries. And so what he's done is some what we call implicit attitude tests, where he's finding the associations between the concept of an immigrant and the concept of a non-white person to try to see how racialized it automatically are people's thoughts about immigrants in the U.S. and in other places. So without spending too much time on what that implicit attitude test is, it's a task that people perform on the computer, where they're asked to press one key on the computer if they see a white face or a white name, that is an Anglo name. The version in their studies would be John. And if you see a darker skin face or a name like Juan, you press another button. And then those two those two names and two faces are switched around so that they're counter stereotypical, and you're asked to press a button when you see a white face and Juan, or a darker skinned face and John. And we see how fast people can press the button in the stereotypical pairings versus the anti-stereotypical pairings. Presumably, if they're holding racialized stereotypes about these individuals, they should be faster at pushing the button when they see a darker face and Juan. Okay, that's the quick IAT primer. Hopefully many of you have heard about this test before. It's supposed to be a measure of the automatic linkage people have between the two attitude objects that you're thinking about. And what we find here, and the important thing here, my student Kirill would say, is actually there are highly racialized schemas associated with that people think of immigrants as non-white, but they actually have there's a lot of variation in that. So the higher scores here, this x-axis goes from -2 to 2 actually, but the higher scores mean that you're very fast at identifying non-white immigrants as non-whites, and you're kind of slow at when you get the white immigrant pairing. You're kind of slow at identifying that that pairing. Well, that's all fine. The mean here suggests we do see racialized pairings, and the authors of this book have an explanation for this that doesn't involve animus. There's no measure of how much you like these groups in this test. This is just a stereotype test. But what I like about this finding is that there's a lot of variation in how quickly people make these pairings in their mind, which means, getting back to my original point, that not everybody thinks about immigrants as racialized. This doesn't contradict anything in the book, actually. It's quite consistent with one of the major arguments in the book, which is that there's a lot of variation in people's attitudes about immigrants that has nothing to do with their animus. But this does bring up the point that when people, I haven't shown you the result, but when people are on the right-hand side of this distribution, their racial attitudes matter a whole bunch more when it comes to predicting immigration policy than when they don't have racial stereotypes about immigrants, which makes perfect sense. These are the people that Matt and Morris would say, the people on the right, that is, would say, well, those are the ones we would actually expect to be using the group centrism system of thought more than the civic fairness, perhaps, or maybe not more, but in addition to the civic fairness values. So I think this is an interesting finding because I think it means that that immigration is not as racialized, actually, as other domains. Perhaps when we do this for welfare, for example, the mean is much higher. And when we do this for affirmative action, the mean is much higher. People associate those things with one racial group, and that is African Americans. So that's one point I would like to make, is that this might not be such an easy test for the group centrism hypothesis because there's so much variation in who the immigrant is, actually, which is quite a surprising result, for me anyway. The second is that they have these two competing causal models. They're very interesting, and I love the way that they talk about this. It's quite provocative, actually. We don't have enough time for me to ask them all the questions I'd like to ask them about these two models, but they lay it out here on page 54. Both views agree that ethnic stereotypes play an important role as intermediary, but group centrism sees these stereotypes as the result of these deep-seated animosities or identities, and immigration policy is the downstream consequence of that. And civic fairness sees them as a link between those fundamental values and the policy views, which are the downstream consequence of that. So if the authors will forgive me if I've got this wrong, but if we were to be very simple-minded about it and we thought about it as a causal chain, we might put it this way, that the group centrism hypothesis says that everyone in the world, all humans, start out with some distrust about people that are different than them. That the ethnocentrism hypothesis says that we have a ubiquitous and long-evolved drive to prefer in-group members to out-group members. And this is not something that's easy to avoid or actually to learn your way out of. And as a result of that, you have negative stereotypes about Latinos and other groups, and those attitudes, group-specific attitudes, then drive immigration policy opinion. The civic fairness argument, on the other hand, says that it actually might be the values that come first. This is a very strong claim, because if we think about it, they're going up against not just everybody in the race and politics literature here, they're also going after evolutionary psychology here, which says this thing comes first for everybody. There are very few evolutionary psychologists who would look at that table that you put up, Matt, talking about all of the different in some cases, highly abstract values that people might hold as adults about what's fair and what isn't, and say those things came first. So this gets to my question that I posed to you maybe last night. I'll pose it to you again tonight at dinner, which is how can we really know which one of these things comes first? And we talk to adults most of the time, but wouldn't it be cool if we talked to kids and saw which of these two types of things seems to come up more often? Now I'm taking too much time, but let me just get to my last point about research, which you all know already, which is that measurement is hard. I, as a person working on the ANES, this is how my life goes now. I talk to my students or my colleagues, and I read a book, and they say, this is what the ANES gave us, so this is what we used. And somehow what the ANES gave them becomes reified in certain ways and helps to motivate entire works. And I feel a little guilty about that sometimes, because I'm helping the PIs make decisions in that moment about whether we should even continue to ask these questions because we think they're terrible. And I think Morris and Matt might agree that in some cases where they say that people are ambivalent about immigration policy, I look at the measures in the American National Election Study that we use, and I think, why did those guys, some of them are in the room, why did those guys choose such a terrible measure of public opinion about immigration? Why did they choose, do you think immigration should be increased, decreased, or kept the same? Or it's not even kept the same, kept about the same, which is a significant difference, because a lot of people will just end up in that middle category. So one of the things I'd like to ask them is, how can we do a better job so that the tests that you want to run and the demonstration that you want to show us might even be clearer? Because I think I already know that you agree that better measurement would be helpful here. The other thing is that measuring ethnocentrism is really difficult, and it isn't their fault. I mean, I say it's weak. It's not. I mean, they could have chosen some different measures if they wanted to, and I actually would like to show you a couple if I had time that are different than the ones they use. But they use something called a feeling thermometer very often, or stereotypes about Latinos as measures of the group attitude. And those things work to predict immigration opinions, and they never deny that. But it does often strike me that we're not seeing directly how important, I mean, in order for us to believe that that the attitude expressed about Latinos in these surveys is really not about groups, but is actually about the way that people use the group label to summarize statistically the arguments that elites are making about who's violating the civic fairness values. That's a very ingenious argument, but it's a lot more complicated than we don't like Latinos. And so what I would like to do is to get away from the measurement of ethnocentrism that is specifically group-based and get to a measure that doesn't mention the specific groups. And then I would like to ask you, if those things end up working, I'd like to ask you, how can you explain that from a civic fairness perspective? So really quickly, we could do any of these weird things that political psychologists like to do. They measure something called out-group empathy, the chance that you will put yourself in the shoes of another group without mentioning which group it is. Or Jim Sidanius's and Felicia Prado's social dominance, which is to ask questions like, pretty blunt questions like, it's probably a good thing that certain groups are at the top and others are at the bottom. Or an ethnocentrism question like, no matter what happens, I'll always support my culture or cultural or ethnic group. And if we see those things mattering a lot, would you still interpret those things as potentially consequences of values? Would they be less problematic for you as measures of group attitudes, purely group attitudes? Or could you still imagine a way that people would answer these in a certain way as a result of their values? That's one question I had. And I'll show you the result that I get in a book that is coming out soon, hopefully, that I've written with some colleagues. So here are the three measures I just showed you. And actually, our ethnocentrism measure doesn't do a very good job of predicting immigration policy opinion, not as well as SDO or group empathy. These are from a regression where they're all in there. And you can see I've cut off the table because there's a million other demographics and other things. But we have the usual suspects of party idea and ideology and perceptions of threat. But then these predispositions that are all about groups, we think, are doing a lot of the work to predict these policies, which, so we're on the bad guy side for you guys. We're on the side that says this is what matters the most, and we actually think this thing matters the most, which is interesting because I think it comes very close to what you guys are calling this humanitarian sentiment. If if you look at the measurement. And you actually find humanitarian sentiment to be a powerful predictor or a powerful mover when you use that as a cue, which I think is extremely interesting. So next steps. Well, one thing is that I'm also really intrigued by is that you mentioned this content analysis of the news that you did on immigration, and you mentioned that you didn't measure the tone of these articles containing cues about groups versus civic fairness. Like when civic fairness is invoked versus groups, are those stories more positive or negative? I think that'd actually be really interesting, and I wonder why you didn't do it, because when I do it, when I look at this is a paper that hasn't been published yet. I'm working on it, but we hand-coded thousands of articles from 1984 to 2016 about the campaign, not about immigration per se, but just during the campaign. And what we see is a fairly flat line for negativity about groups mentioned in campaign articles, but then after 2000, a fairly steep, well, I'm going to call this a steep increase. You might say it's flat until 2012, and then we have the spike with Trump. But I wonder what you guys would think of that. There's a lot of negativity about groups, we think, revealed by these data. And which groups are they? It's Arab Americans, Black Americans are pretty constant, and then immigrants gets this spike in 1994. That's the California moment. That's the Prop 187 moment. And then again in 2016 when Trump gets into full swing. So those things seem that, again, not to contradict your argument, actually, I would really just like to have this for civic values discussions. When are we hearing positive versus negative stories about violations? And does it matter to you that does it help the group centrism hypothesis at all that there is a lot of group-specific negativity here in the environment, and it's increasing, it seems, at least for some groups? I think I'll skip this one because I basically mentioned it. But one thing that I wish you had shown in the text more often is just, I know you're not into the battle of the regression coefficients, but all of your mentors are into the battle of regression coefficients at some level. Forgive me, Jack, but I think that's true. And when you do put those coefficients against each other, your own evidence suggests ethnocentrism matters a whole lot and maybe matters more as an association with these outcomes. So, the last thing I'll say is, can we do a study together where we would talk to young people and think about how crystallized are their values versus how crystallized are their group identities and attitudes? Would that help you guys to show more of what you're trying to argue, that this is really a story, an American story, not about who you are and who they are, but about the rules we all have to live by? And that, to me, we don't do enough work on political socialization anymore. I think my answer when Matt asked me why not is because it's hard, which is usually why we don't do stuff in any domain of life. But we shouldn't use that as an excuse. We should get the money and talk to young people, really young people, and ask them about politics and see what comes up. Your strong inclination, I suppose, is that the rules are going to come up, not the groups, or at least that there'll be a mix. It's not going to be just about the groups. And when I think about it that way, I think maybe you're really onto something, because that's certainly true for my children. And they talked about the rules a lot. That resonates with me. But my children are sort of strange, so I don't know if they represent the American people. So I would say, please, everybody, buy the book. I'm not obligated to say that. I don't get any royalties, but it's a really interesting book, and it disrupts the kind of parties I go to a lot. I don't know if it would be very disruptive at the parties you go to. So thank you very much. Thank you for writing this wonderful book.
Thanks so much.
In the interest of time, I am not going to let Morris and Matt respond immediately. You're going to keep your notes in front of you. And we're going to take commentary, and I'm going to use my moderator power right now. I'm going to ask a question too. And I have not read the book, so this is based just on the presentation. But you talk a lot about fairness, and I think the other way to think about that often is deservingness, right? If we think about social policy, and if we think immigration is a social policy of you're really damn lucky to be able to come here into our country where we have a good economic system, good legal system, et cetera, then this rhetoric of deservingness becomes very important. And we know that's tinged in the US with race and particular sort of racialized tropes about who is deserving. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think of deservingness versus fairness. And now I'm going to open the floor, and I'm going to collect 2 or 3 comments, and then you guys can respond.
Sure.
Yes. And please introduce yourself.
I'm curious about a very, very elementary question, which is how much do the people know about immigration, about the immigration system? My guess is that they have no idea how many immigrants come in each year. They have no idea what the ratio between legal and undocumented is. They have no idea what the basis for admission is other than families and occupations. They have no idea what percentage of the immigration stream is constituted by those and so forth. My guess is they would have no idea about these issues, and if they are as ignorant as that, it seems to me we would want to know that in assessing the attitudes that you exhume.
Just a quick one. You mentioned Evan Saunders, visiting guest. You mentioned the American ambivalence in views towards immigration. Could you comment as that compares worldwide, European, Middle Eastern, whether you feel that there are other areas of the world that have much more strongly held views on immigration? Thank you.
Ned Permal in Rhetoric and Political Science. I'm a lecturer. Did you consider running your research tests by gender and by race?
Hi, I'm Mark Frisbee. I'm a friend of Nad's. I graduated in '73. I just live in the area. But he invited me, and I'm glad I came. So my question is, maybe a stupid question for somebody who's not an academic and not a sociologist, but is there any way that you sort of controlled or grouped how you judged American opinion? I don't know if that's based on articles. I mean, I don't know how you judge what typical American opinion is, because I would think that would vary a lot depending particularly on income level. And I'd be very interested in what viewpoints are of folks who are above the poverty line, i.e. not entitled to government support, and below, say, the top 25% of income earners. Those are the ones who haven't seemed to benefit very much over the past 40 years, and I would think would have some strong opinions that might be different than the other groups about immigration.
I think we'll let Matt and Morris respond now.
Yeah, great questions.
Yes.
Do you want me to do deserving this versus fair?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, what's that?
One right in front of you.
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, hello. Okay, good. So that's a pretty good question, given that you haven't read the book, and it would be good even if you had. Yeah, no, I think a lot of the fairness judgments that we're talking about could be cast as deservingness. One exception might be some of the humanitarian based arguments in which deservingness wouldn't seem to be quite. I mean, I guess you could even cast that as deservingness, but in other words, deserving of our sympathy and help. Yeah, I don't know. And so then you point to the racialized aspect of deservingness and fairness, and that's certainly true. And I guess you can point to one possible critique of us on that basis, along with the way that we've been trying to think about it. The way that we've been trying to think about it is, well, then, given that we know that deservingness has racial dimensions in the way that people think about it in the U.S., how even-handedly do people apply those kinds of deservingness judgments? In other words, do they use one set of standards for immigrants from one group and one set of standards for immigrants from another? And what we generally find is that they don't. This is in the context of our studies. So the possible critique, I think, and we were talking about this a little bit with Nick as well, is that in the broader scheme of things, people might be comfortable being even-handed in these ways because they know that by applying these kinds of rules, or they think they know, they would over time, in general, be benefiting immigrants from their own group who benefit from this particular set of rules, which then they can apply even-handedly, if that makes sense. Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
Not to that, I would say.
You want to take it?
But I agree. Yeah. But I agree with that, for sure what he said.
We always do. Right?
We never disagree about anything. That's why there are so few footnotes in the book. I want to get to this question about innumeracy. First, I hope you saw that you played a figure.
We love your work.
You figured quite handily in this, and so I'm so happy that you're here to ask this question and to have this conversation about it. People don't know anything, really. People are profoundly innumerate, and they don't. Furthermore, it's not that yes, it's hard to guess a number, right? So that's one thing, but they also don't. We've tried. You ask people, well, how many do you think come in on each of these categories? Well, firstly, what are the categories that people come in on, and what proportion of people come in on different categories? And they don't really know the answer. The good news for us is it doesn't. So our theory doesn't really require them to know very much about it, right? So. If, for instance, one of our contentions is that people are going to be especially hostile to an immigrant they view as coming in an undocumented fashion and thus cutting in the line in front of people who came legally, that person doesn't need to know how many there are or how big of a problem it is or how many come in on other categories or whatever. They can just make a judgment sort of deontologically based on that. The other thing that I would just say, on that subject is we've tried giving people information about that sort of thing, and it almost never, I don't think it ever changes.
It doesn't change the.
It doesn't change the storyline, basically.
Cues,
yeah. So, and I also I'm happy to hear. I'll stop talking. We've done a lot of talking.
Can I just add?
Oh
one
yeah,
thing
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is well taken. So one possible reaction then is. Well, if people don't know any of this stuff, what are they using to form judgments about immigration? Well, you could ask the same question about any issue area in politics. People are generally quite ignorant of any kind of policy specifics, how systems work, and so on. None of this is specific to immigration, and so the usual way that we think about these things, I think Nick would agree, is that people take cues that are available in the poll questions that we put to them, most of which they haven't thought a whole lot about before. And so one way of thinking about their answers is just what considerations do those questions bring to mind, and how do they weigh them? So I think this is not necessarily any different in that regard.
Can I say two quick things to some of Nick's presentation too, which Nick has given us a lot to think about. So I'll keep it quick. The first thing I will do is I will say I was deeply interested in this question of if we went and interviewed a bunch of 8-year-olds, what is it that they think about when you ask them about politics, when you ask them about society? I want to know the answer. I've been thinking about it a lot and trying to think is it the case? Do we tell our kids about bad guys, right, versus good guys, or do we tell them about what are the rules? And I think Nick is right that if pushed, I would say the rules probably come first. But I don't know, right? I think this is a super interesting thing, and I would love to pursue this. Just a quick point on measurement. Nick is totally right that it's really hard to measure these things, and a lot of the ambivalence could be just the fact that people are being pushed into categories, or they're putting themselves into categories that are kind of hovering around the center, and that there's not really a strong core there. One of the things we do about that is we like to think about, it's relative, right? Immigration is one issue. We ask people about all kinds of issues, so we can very easily dredge up like the General Social Survey and show that the stability of party identification is much higher than people's attitudes on immigration. Indeed, it's higher than people's belief in God, which is somewhat astounding. And but immigration is not it's not an issue that people seem to have especially strong, even versus other issues. The other thing is we try to make, with this in mind, we try to make as much of our case as possible so that it's not measurement dependent, so that we construct an experiment so we don't have to worry about whether or not we're getting that question right. But yeah, measurement is absolutely hard. I think I'll stop there. But did you want to pick up?
Well, let me, I guess, address just a couple of the other questions quickly.
Yeah.
One was, sorry if I'm taking these out of order, whether we looked at results by gender and race. Not by gender. We didn't have any theoretical expectation about that, though that could be an oversight on our part. By race, yes, we did unpack, I think, nearly every result by race. And what's interesting is that you see differences kind of in general, not surprisingly, across many different issue areas, Latinos and to some degree African Americans, though less so. Those were the groups that we had large enough samples for, usually, to make any kind of meaningful comparison, are more supportive of immigration. But many of the treatments, many of the experiments that we ran showed similar effects on all groups. There's one actually really notable exception to this, which is that when we looked at how and what types of people differentiated between legal and undocumented immigration, we found that the impact of kind of a general orientation toward law and order had a much weaker impact among African Americans and their opinions about illegal immigration than it did among both whites and Latinos. And one interpretation of this, and it's been offered elsewhere by Natalie Masuoka and Jane Junn in their book on immigration attitudes, which is called The Politics of Belonging, is that African Americans, for fairly obvious reasons, have a great deal of skepticism about these law and order type arguments that isn't shared by other groups. So we found some differences, but mostly similarities in the types of things that people are weighing. Let me see. So the question about where our measures of opinion come from. This is overwhelmingly survey research. We're asking people their opinions. If they're kind enough to answer the questions honestly, we can learn something about what they think. So that's the source of the vast majority of data in the book. As far as variation by income level, I don't think we looked much at income in particular. So there are two things to say. One is that to the extent that income goes along with education, which is imperfect, but as professors know all too well, but still a pretty tight relationship. More education promotes more tolerant attitudes almost across the board. And that is true with respect to racial tolerance. It's true with respect to pro-immigrant attitudes as well. And that's pretty consistent. There's one other thing to say, though, which is I think you were getting at the idea that self-interest might play a big role in shaping these attitudes. Some people lose out from immigration, some people win out. The general view in the political science and sociology literatures is that it plays a surprisingly weak role in shaping people's attitudes, and that it is the kind of more group-centered and maybe, in our work, the normative stuff that's mattering more. One example of that is that if you think about the types of immigrants that a self-interested person would prefer, a low-skilled worker would prefer high-skilled immigrants, and a high-skilled worker would presumably prefer low-skilled immigrants, people who wouldn't compete with them. And that doesn't pan out nearly as cleanly as you'd expect on the basis of that hypothesis. I'll let Matt address, if he wants, the question about Europe quickly. Yeah.
So I'm hoping we get money to study that exact question, actually. I've been struck in the relatively short time that I've been doing this, how people on both sides of the ocean talk about very similar things, but it's harder to find tests of these kinds of questions. My hunch at the moment would be that it's most likely the case that attitudes in Europe are a little bit more, they're a little bit less variegated on the subject of immigration than they are in the U.S. But that's only a hunch. Even Boris might not share it. So I'm not gonna speak for him. But my guess is that the discourse there is, I see less cleavage in terms of the policies that are under discussion, and I see a much more, so Nick pointed out, rightly I think, that immigrants in the U.S. are a varied group, and so people are going to stereotype different policies. I thought that, you know, the Muslim ban versus the wall was a great example of that, that people are going to, you know, call different groups to mind implicitly or explicitly when they think about this stuff. I think that's less the case in Europe, where the sort of, you know, problematic aspects of immigration are much more easily tied in the discourse to Islam and to Muslim immigrants. But that's all speculation at this point. So like I look forward to actually putting that to the test and seeing if that's true or not.
Add just two things to that. One is a point about how Europeans and Americans, and to some extent Canadians, think about assimilation. What does it require? What do we really want immigrants to do? Or what is important? We asked a battery of questions about this, and he said, you know, learning English, holding American values like freedom and equality, you know, I think we had becoming a citizen. These were all very, very important to everybody that we asked in the U.S. Other things, such as, you know, kind of thicker aspects of the culture were much less important. Celebrating American holidays, you know, we didn't ask about names, but you know, eating American foods, dressing a certain way, and interacting with other Americans rather than you know, remaining in a social enclave, let's say, were much less important to Americans. And then at the very bottom of the list was anything that involved giving up an aspect of one's own culture. So at least outwardly, people were telling us that they had quite pluralistic attitudes about assimilation. And we don't know how these same measures would pan out in Europe, but one indication is that there's a question that's been asked on cross-national surveys. Should, in order to be a true, you know, French, German, American, whatever, fill in the blank nationality, minority groups should have to give up their own customs and blend in to, you know, this is kind of a hard-nosed assimilationist question. And in the US, about 4% say that that's very important to do. Something like a quarter say it's important. In France and Germany, the figure saying it's important is much more like 50%. In Canada, it's like 8% very important, and so it's a little bit higher than the US, but still far to the pluralistic end of the spectrum. So that's an indication that there may be very different understandings of what the dictates are, what makes one deserving, and what's required for that.
So I have one thing just to add to that, which is that the theoretical implication of the answer to that question, whatever it is actually quite, as far as I'm concerned, quite important. Because it speaks to the broader question, and Nick raised this too in his comments, about whether or not we are, when we talk about values, whether we're talking about something that's universally human, and thus sort of applicable comparably across all kinds of political contexts, or whether it's something that's more akin to something that's politically constructed or cultural, or you know, political, cultural, you know, a package of values that's inherited over time. That isn't sort of intrinsic to the species or social organization. And so answering that question might help us shed some light on that question, which I think is a very important unanswered one in the literature.
Yes. So why don't we do one more round of questions, because I know we also have a reception, and we should all make sure that we
Okay.
cover that. So Jack.
So I have a question of all three of you, and that is, to what extent do you believe that stereotypes are based in part on reality? If you looked at your students, Russian students thing, and
you said something about a reception?
okay, if you look at your Russian students' results, and the implication is that most people associate immigrants with being non-white, as far as I can tell, and maybe this is a Peter Schuck says, I don't know the answer to this, it's ignorance speaking here. As far as I know, at the present time, most immigrants to the United States are non-white. So to what extent is that racial prejudice, or someone, you know, just expressing a cultural stereotype that's based really in large part on reality? And this gets, you know, I'm not going to get into the IAT, about which I have a lot of skepticism, so we won't do these arcane academic things. So that's just my question, but just an observation. If you dropped in a person from Mars into San Francisco, and the only place you let that person go was the San Francisco Symphony, okay? Every concert, and that's the only, your only vision of America. the right inference would be that 90% of the people in the United States are either Russian speakers or Chinese. So to what extent, is there reality rather than this other kind of phenomenon going on?
Following up on, my name's Ken Koziol. I'm a retired staff person at Berkeley. But I'm also 100% Polish descent. And I want to make a point on the caveats of actually surveying Europe. And the word is Brexit. It's nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with people from that part of the world. Being 100% Polish, the early literature or effect of that impetus for Brexit are Polish workers who work really hard and for 2/3 of the cost of a worker, and have displaced many, many, many thousands of British workers. I also studied in France in '72. The conversation was not even about the people from North Africa. It was Portuguese workers and Spanish workers who were coming attracted into France and displacing, maids and other people like that. So trying to get attitudes of, varies of time. Maybe the more current thing in France might be Islamic immigration, but and by age group, if you interviewed someone my age in France, it might have those other echoes. So you'd have to really, to work on that. One small thing, though, this is nothing to do with that, but the Declaration of Independence, has anyone ever surveyed? There's a clause about migration in our Declaration of Independence. Does anyone know that? First of all. And second of all, what were our original attitudes talking about equality? Because all men are created equal. And buried in this text is the fact that they presumed that King George was suppressing immigration. Anyway, that's...
Hi, there's Merrill Shanks. I don't know whether this is a question or an observation. You, at several places, talked about these competing or rival causal models, and that didn't sound right to me. You've got two very different kinds of considerations or attitudes or beliefs that are usually mixed up in some combinations, but I was saying, are these really different models? And the only thing that struck me as like that has to do with the question of temporal sequence. This is which came first. Is one of these two bundles of things more important in the sense that it arrives, human beings arrive at it somewhat earlier than the others? And I don't know. Of course, it would require studying children in order to get a handle on that. But I was wondering whether you really mean different models or just two different kinds of considerations or attitudes.
Sorry I couldn't get here sooner. Avi Rosenzweig, I'm staff on the other side of campus. Last year there was an EU delegate giving a talk up at the I House from Germany, and he was talking about Islamophobia in Germany. And afterwards I was talking to him and he said, today they use terms about how are you labeling the other, and the other involves Muslims. But I said, when I was younger, nobody complained about Muslims in Germany. They complained about Turks in Germany or Algerians, and same thing in France. But it would have been Moroccans or other North Africans. So do you make anything, and what do you make of the idea that the terms in which we use for others has shifted over the last decade or two from being nation-centered to being either religion-centered or ethnicity-centered? And isn't that an interesting development? I think it's a parallel issue in the US that our current use of whiteness and whiteness terms and whiteness studies seems to me to be a really strange way of sort of incorporating non-WASPs into the category of whiteness. That same thing when I was younger, growing up on the East Coast, the category WASP or Gentile was a much more important category than it seems to be today. Now it seems to be subsumed in this more general category of whiteness. Whose interest does that serve?
Okay, so I will quickly say to Jack that I do believe that stereotypes are in part, many stereotypes are in part imbued with some real data. This is the one that Kirill showed is one of those. It's quite obviously the case that in America right now, the dominant groups of immigrants are not from Europe, not white Anglo-Europeans. But that's not a measure of racism or prejudice, actually. It's just a measure of perceptions. The point of putting that up there was that when you multiply that distribution times how people feel about the group, that is, when you take the people who both think immigrants are non-white and don't like non-whites, then you can understand immigration opinion much better than by looking at the attitudes about non-whites among people who don't think immigrants are non-white. So whoever's right and whoever's wrong is really not. Yeah, it's not whoever's right and whoever's wrong. It's the interesting fact of the variation times the attitude that makes the big difference in those data. That's the point I wanted to make there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, some stereotypes have a basis in reality and other stereotypes don't. One example would be the stereotypes about the rates at which immigrants commit crime. If a person from Mars came into this country and surveyed, the population of convicted felons, he would probably find a lot of Trump's rhetoric awfully curious. So I think some are and some aren't. I wonder. I wonder what the next step in your argument would be. So then, if there is a basis in reality, people are rational to make use of them. They would also be rational to make use of additional information where it's pertinent if that information counteracts stereotypes, right or wrong, correct stereotypes or incorrect stereotypes. That is not continuing to use the stereotype beyond its applicability. One other point, given your example of concert goers, it would be curious, I think, if the Martian parachuted to Earth and saw the audience and came away very fixated on the fact that Russian was the dominant language and spoken, and that ethnicity and race, let's say, or national origin were the point of fixation, rather than, oh, these seem to be very affluent people, or they seem to be largely elderly people. In other words, the stereotypes can be accurate, and yet the emphasis that we place on them can have a basis in something other than their social importance.
So I'm going to dodge the stereotype thing. They've answered it well. It's fine. I'm interested in thinking about these some of the points raised about the difficulty of thinking about Europe as a case, both over time and across countries. I take the example about Brexit and Poles and Polish workers. I think all these are fair points. Actually, I think Islamophobia per se has become increasingly very well studied in these contexts, but there's a lot left on the table of that sort, these sorts of variations. I don't think we can answer any of these questions until we start asking people not only the kinds of things Morris mentioned earlier, like what do we expect immigrants to do or what do we expect them not to do, but also, what do we think they actually do? Where do we think they actually come from? All of these kinds of questions. I mean, these haven't been asked on sort of big cross-national surveys, partly because it's difficult. So these big surveys tend to sort of boil down to the simplest, kind of most easily translatable things, and that's not what we really need to answer these kinds of questions. So I think it's true across the board that there's a lot of nuance there that I might have downplayed in my speculation. It's an empirical question, and I'm curious to find the answer. As to the sort of original, America's original position on immigration, I mean, there's a rich literature on this subject about how this country has defined itself going all the way back, and depending on who's telling the story, what aspects of it get brought. I mean, there were nativists back then, there are nativists now, right? I mean, these sorts of things have ebbed and flowed in American history. There have been more optimistic currents, there have been more pessimistic currents. There's a really rich storyline there, and I think part of what we're trying to do, and we didn't really get to this in the presentation very much, but part of what we're trying to do is address a sort of major theoretical debate about what kind of a country America is. And that's kind of a broad, overbroad, ridiculous, issue in some ways. But it strikes us that the sort of this literature, the normative literature, and then the sort of historical institutionalist literature on America and its relationship to immigrants has, in recent years, sort of overemphasized. Overemphasized is not the right word, but sort of focused on structural racism and these sorts of currents of bigotry and discrimination and all of that. And what we're trying to do is try to see whether Gunnar Myrdal's optimism, is still something that we can look to. Whether or not, Americans, when they're forced to confront, what they say their values actually are, whether or not they continue to hold out racist ideals, or whether they sort of see the light, as it were. So we think that, our results are kind of suggestive in that way, I think. That's kind of the argument that we want to make. It's really hard to address empirical survey evidence like this to those sorts of big questions, but I would say we take a somewhat more optimistic position on a lot of these big issues. But these are things that we're going to talk about forever, and I think that's a good thing.
I think on the